Hello and welcome to Web Development 101 with Alex Merced. On this show, we'll talk about all the basic concepts of web development in a way that anyone can understand, whether it's front-end web development, back-end web development, and full-stack web development. If you're new to web development, I recommend listening from episode 1 to understand all the concepts from beginning to end. You can also learn more about my own personal projects over there at alexmercedcoder.com. Thank you. Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and basically today what I want to talk about is APIs. APIs are a very important integral part to web design, and kind of understanding sort of the technology and the basic principles of it is very important. So I can't believe I totally forgot what the A stands for, but it's basically, I think it's Advanced Programming Interface. The A might be something else. It's escaping me at the moment. But an API, essentially think of it as a way to communicate with the back end of your website. So remember, once upon a time, the internet was a lot slower. So the way you stored information was through cookies on someone's computer. So your website would then reference those cookies, those little files in the computer, and render everything on that client's computer. So that way you were sending away less information. Now that computers are faster, storage is cheaper, all these kind of things, you're storing more data sort of on your server. So that's great, okay? So that's one difference. The second difference is that now websites are interoperable. You may want to go get information from YouTube or Facebook to show on your website, to kind of integrate Facebook and YouTube and other websites into your website to create this sort of really cool experience for the user. Okay, but Facebook or YouTube isn't going to give you direct access into their database. So what websites do is they create an API, okay, that programming interface. And what that does, it allows either their own website or other websites to be able to sort of get access to certain aspects of the data within a framework that they want to set up. So this API framework then sends data to the other website that they're allowed to get. Now, the old days, okay, I don't think this is for the most part as done anymore unless you're sending huge amounts or really complex data structures. What used to be used was XML. Okay, XML, it's hard to kind of explain XML. Imagine once upon a time there was sort of this thought that we'll just subtract design completely out of HTML and we'll just use XML. So in XML you would just use all semantic tags and literally do everything in the CSS for the most part. The CSS would just handle all the visual aspects, location, everything. It would just be sort of a structure, so that way the data of your website, the content, can then be delivered in many different platforms. Especially like mobile, because back in those days, like mobile was just purely like a text screen. Remember those old Blackberries? So having sort of an XML file that had no styling in it was kind of useful to show the information of the website on your screen. But at the same time, a CSS enabled browser could then show that. But phones got smarter, phones started showing styling, that wasn't as necessary anymore. But also when you would send information between websites, APIs, you would do it in XML as well. Eventually JSON became sort of the new standard, which stands for a JavaScript object notation. And that's, if you've learned JavaScript, you've probably learned about JavaScript objects, which to me was initially confusing because whenever I thought of like objects originally, I always thought of like an instance of a class when you think like object-oriented programming. And then plus I had just learned Python. So to me, what an object is in JavaScript is more similar to like a dictionary in Python. So that threw me for a loop for a bit to kind of separate the idea of a class, so creating like instances of classes in JavaScript versus sort of object, which sort of was key in data. So I would sit there and say, okay, name equals Bob, social security number equals X, etc. But JavaScript objects are essentially those key pairs, okay? Key and data, key and data, key and data. And then people started using JSON. I think part of what made JSON really increase sort of the popularity of JSON was that it was quicker. But also, and then I think the fact that JSON started becoming more popular as far as using APIs and sending information from one computer to another is partly what contributed to sort of the popularity of JavaScript in the back end and MongoDB for reasons I don't fully understand yet. They were just sort of in the right place. Like if you listen to that Node.js masterclass on Skillshare, they kind of go into the whole history of this. It's actually really interesting kind of how all these technologies kind of converged and kind of appeared at the same time and just were very complementary, leading to them to capture a lot of market share. But yeah, so JSON was kind of the standard. And the way generally your APIs would traditionally work is that you'd set up the API, which would mean you would then, your website, so if I want to use like YouTube or Billboard 100's API, my website would then use something like a fetch. So fetch is sort of the current way in JavaScript that you would go fetch information from an API. I would say fetch from this URL. And then the URL will then grab the information, and then I can do what I want with it. But the way you would send a query, so if you only want like a substantive information, the query, you would have to put in a very sort of particular URL that puts in all that data, because it's going to give you whatever data that the API is going to give you. It's just kind of one way, and then you can also post to it. You could actually sit there and submit stuff. So let's say you want to add a field to a list. So for example, if you have a Trello and then you incorporate your Trello into Slack may be using Trello's API to communicate with your Trello account and add those cards and those list items to your Trello field. Okay, so it goes both ways. There's get and post. Okay, so I can post something and I can get something. But the thing is that having to do all these URLs and figure out the URL structure and then code the use of those URL structures into your code, it's fine. It works. It's the standard, and I don't think there's really too much of a problem with it. But it would be nice if there was just one URL. And from that one URL, you could send more structured queries and maybe work a little bit faster and whatnot. And that's kind of where this new technology, GraphQL, Graph Query Language, comes into play. So basically there, you would have a GraphQL server, and then basically when you fetch from the API URL, you would use sort of a different way it would just be done differently, but you'd be able to actually send queries. So instead of you having to go to the URL for the specific thing you're looking for, and then changing the endpoint to structure your data, you would actually just say, hey, go to this URL and get me these items. Don't show me these rows. This is what I want, which is pretty cool. Okay, it makes it a lot more like just traditional working directly with databases. And again, the biggest benefit of APIs is when you're working with another website's information. Other uses for APIs is to communicate back and front. So for example, a lot of people like Django, which is a Python backend. We haven't talked much about backend yet. We'll talk more about that in the future episodes. But it's really easy to create an API. And it's usually a standard API that uses JSON and whatnot, referred to as a RESTful API. So RESTful is a specification, meaning so these are the standards of how you do it. It's not a particular program on how to do it. So oftentimes you have specifications, and then people create tools to follow that specification. Okay, it's just lingo. But yeah, that's what's happening with the API. Okay, so I would go fetch data from here. But now what happens is that if I use Django to create the REST API, oftentimes you might feel like, oh, well, Django kind of does back and front end. It does the whole, website if you want it to. But what if I really like using React or Vue or Angular for creating like the user interface and basically the overall feel of the website? What I can do is then create the REST API in Django, and then basically create the React, Angular, or Vue front end, and then just make API calls to that Django API and make my website. And to the user experience will be the same. Like it'll be the way I want it. So these are the kind of cool things about APIs. So oftentimes you can choose whatever backend you want. You can use from all these different backend softwares, whether it's Python with Flask or Django, or you're talking about Ruby on Rails or Ruby with Sinatra, any of these kind of backend frameworks where you can create and manipulate data, create APIs that then your front end tools then call and allow the website to interact for your user. So there's a lot of really good uses for APIs. So a lot of your web design, when you're creating full-on applications, is really working with these APIs and making sure that your front end is calling the right information, displaying it at the right time, and then the back end, all the information is set up in a way for it to accomplish the things that your user needs. So, and then the API, whether it's GraphQL or JSON or XML, is the piece that sort of allows the two to all kind of smooth. So it's really important to understand that. So my name is Alex Merced. You guys have a great day and enjoy.